Welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar titled Implementation, Replication, Fidelity, How to Really Scale High Impact Tutoring. And so back in January, CGLR launched the new year in its new GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar series called Big Bets Working. And we included a session on high impact tutoring where we focused on the landscape of successful programs and where, how, and why tutoring is making a real impact. We explored the evidence and examples that demonstrate how and how much this critical intervention is advancing students along the learning continuum. Our January discussion generated knowledge to help us all advocate for sustaining essential programs, past the forthcoming ESSER funding cliff, for ongoing learning recovery, which we all know is a long game. And with tutoring being one of the most prominent strategies providing students with the learning support they need to recover from pandemic school closures, we also heard President Joe Biden emphasize how important it is to sustain this important intervention when he said he wants to expand high impact or high quality tutoring in his State of the Union speech. So it is clear that tutoring is working and needs to continue expanding to ensure all students have access to this support. So today we're going to revisit this big bet working and unpack what it really takes to implement a successful tutoring program. So thinking about things like establishing programs and partnerships with or within a school system, conducting tutoring sessions both in school and out of school, recruiting, training, and retaining tutors, ensuring regular attendance by students, building relationships at all levels with students, with teachers, with school administrators, with parents and families, and more to ensure the right instruction and support is being provided to tutors over time, by tutors over time. And once successfully implemented, it is important to understand how a successful program can scale to reach as many students as possible. Many states have scaled to multiple, have scaled statewide, and other successful tutoring programs have been able to scale to multiple states and communities. And much has been learned about implementation science and replicating successful models with Fidelity. And so our session today is focused on engaging leaders in the tutoring space and sharing these learnings so that more programs can achieve success for students and all students can continue to work with their tutors and progress in their learning and development. And we are joined today by top tutoring researchers and experts who will share what they have learned over the past 4 years about implementation best practices, as well as leaders from programs and a State Department of Education who have successfully scaled high impact tutoring. Today's discussion will be moderated by Kevin Huffman, who is the founding CEO of Accelerate, a national initiative that seeks to embed high-impact tutoring and personalized learning in public schools. Huffman is the former Tennessee Commissioner of Education, where he managed the State Department of Education in its efforts to advance the academic progress of nearly 1 million students. And now I'm honored to welcome and briefly introduce our esteemed panelists who are with us today in alphabetical order. And please note that full bios have been linked in the chat, so I'm just previewing who we have with us today. First, we have Eric Duncan. He is the Director for P12 Policy at the Education Trust, specializing in policies related to educator equity and increasing the racial diversity of the educator workforce. Eric previously was a state policy advisor at WestEd, where he supported the organization's federal and state policy strategy. Mary Ellen Lenigan is Chief for State and District Partnerships with Saga Education, where she oversees all state and district contracts for technical assistance and quality assurance, where Saga is currently supporting over 300 schools across the country. She has been in the education field for over 10 years and was an algebra teacher before joining Saga. Patrick Steck is Deans for Impact's Vice President of External Affairs and a leading voice on the issue of expanding access to practice-based, instructionally focused pathways into teaching. With a keen focus on accelerating student learning, solving local educator shortages, and diversifying the teaching profession, Patrick has positioned Deans for Impact as a national policy and advocacy leader. David Weinstein is the founder of Joyful Readers, and his parents will tell you that he entered kindergarten claiming he would never learn to read, but by second grade, he was voraciously consuming Goosebumps books faster than R.L. Stine could write them. Then later in life, he moved to Philadelphia to do a year of AmeriCorps service with City Year, and that one-year program turned into a 15-year career, with David ultimately managing all of City Year's school-based services. Adiola or Ola Whitney brings 20-plus years of education leadership experience to the CEO role with Reading Partners. Ola was previously with iMentor, where she led the expansion and implementation of the College Success Program and managed executive leadership in the Bay Area, Baltimore, Chicago, and New York City. Ola has also had leadership and management roles with Playworks, Kaplan, and McGraw-Hill. And finally, Tess Yates is the Senior Director of Learning Acceleration at the Tennessee Department of Education. In her role, Tess oversees both Tennessee's statewide summer learning program, which serves approximately 100,000 students annually, and the statewide tutoring program, Tennessee All-Core, which is Tennessee's high-dosage, low-ratio tutoring program that has served 200,000 plus students over the past 3 years across 90 plus districts and community partners working to rapidly accelerate students to grade level. So welcome to all of you. We look forward to engaging with and learning with you today. And I'm now excited to turn it over to Kevin Huffman to get our conversation going.
Great. Thank you, Emily. I'm excited to be here and excited to be among so many friends on the panel and in the audience as I've seen people logging in. I liked the way, Emily, when you were introducing this, you said really scale. It was a great point of emphasis there. So we are at an exciting and important juncture for high dosage tutoring. On the one hand, the visibility for tutoring has never been higher. The district interest has never been higher. Emily noted the State of the Union call out. There are bipartisan state leaders who have been pushing to expand high dosage tutoring. It is one of the nice things in education that seems to be largely apolitical. We hope it stays that way with broad interest. Most districts in the country are trying high dosage tutoring in some form. But at the same time, the penetration of high dosage tutoring is lower than it could be. IES reports from its survey analysis that around 10% of kids have access to tutoring. That is probably overstated by the time you look under the hood and see how many kids are actually getting the tutoring that they are assigned. And we know that both the reach and the uptake, ensuring that kids actually get the number of lessons they're supposed to get, has to become higher over time. The good news is we have learned a lot over the last 2 to 3 years about how to scale. And we have an incredible panel today who are going to be able to talk about scale, coming at it from different ways, from their experiences as researchers, policy leads from the SEA, from implementing programs inside systems. And I think we're going to gain a lot from just hearing different people's perspectives on what is scale and how do you get to scale in high dosage tutoring. So I thought that maybe I would start by answering the question myself, and then I'll ask other people as they as I turn to them to answer a similar question on when you say scale, what does that mean to you? So for me, when I think about scale, I know that it is true that all kids can benefit from tutoring, but I don't think that is a very useful thing to say to state agency and district leaders who are trying to figure out how to direct their programming. Scale for me is whether all kids who need tutoring in a particular area of focus are able to access it. So to me, it is about picking the priority area that your school or your district or your state is really obsessively focused on, picking the groups of kids who you think can benefit the most, and ensuring that they are getting not only assigned to tutoring, but that it's being tracked and they're getting the number of sessions that they're supposed to get. So we've seen across the country that the districts that have really been at this for the last 2 or 3 years, building slowly and ensuring that kids really get the tutoring they're supposed to get, are now at the point where they're getting to 10 to 20% of the kids in the district. But if you look even deeper, it's a much higher percentage of kids in particular areas. And so if your focus is K-3 literacy and you are targeting kids who are behind grade level on trackers in K-3 literacy, then being able to get to all of those kids might only be 20% of the kids in the district or 10% of the kids in the district, but it might be 40 or 50% of the kids that are in that grade, and ensuring that it's done well. So to me, scale is a combination of both the area of focus, hitting all the kids who need it, and ensuring that there's actual delivery. But I think you'll see that we all think about this slightly differently. And I'm going to start in thinking about some of the national programming, and some of the national conversation around scale. And I'll start with Eric and would love to engage you and talk about your work at EdTrust. And I'll start with just a simple question. When you think about scaling tutoring, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Excited to be here and talk about this issue. Just to frame this, in the context of how the Education Trust, we're an organization at the national level that's working to close opportunity gaps for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And so, we've looked at tutoring and programs from some of the leaders of organizations like SAGA and Joy for Readers and Reading Partners, and have always sort of admired them and some of the work that they've done to address specific student populations. And to your point, Kevin, those students who need a little bit extra support. And so, our analysis when we looked at what are the key components of high dosage tutoring was really in response to the unfinished learning question that, sort of took us into this crisis where a majority of our country, was grappling with school closures and the impact that learning loss and unfinished learning had on all students, but in particular, the most vulnerable student populations. So, again, taking what we've learned from the work that's been done for a number of years through some of these organizations that have really been dedicated to it, and where there are specific school-based or district-based initiatives, or even at times state-supported initiatives to support some of these programs that are doing this great work. We really see the way that this conversation has gone, where we're trying to scale that up to the state level, provide national resources and infrastructure at the state and district level for folks to really engage in targeted intensive tutoring using data, using information about their student populations, and saying, how can we make sure that we have a systemic approach to providing tutors and the key components to that additional instruction that's necessary to reach as many of those students as we possibly can. So I really like, Kevin, your framing about sort of what scaling means. And we sort of underwent a similar analysis, looking at what are the groups that have already been doing this work for a long period of time and have been successful in pockets. What are they doing well, and how can we make sure that there's strategic investments that are data informed to make sure that every student, in as best as possible in a state or local context, is at least being analyzed to determine how to bolster their educational experiences to ensure that they have as much support as necessary to, in this case of this massive learning loss, sort of reach their grade level because of the unfinished learning. But really, like, having this analysis across the state, across the nation, saying, we think tutoring is a high leverage strategy. How do we make sure that every system has access to the benefits of it?
And what have you learned from your research about best strategies when you think about effective implementation? When you all look around and study places that seem to be learning important lessons, what do you see?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Emily added this in the chat, so you can go in depth in our briefs that include this information, but just want to sort of hit some high level points and then really emphasize one key point that we really want to emphasize. So, the type of tutors that are instructing students really should be, we think, at the highest level, certified teachers and or staff that has been well trained and supported to provide the instruction that's aligned with curriculum and the curriculum standards. And so, we would prefer the certified teachers that have that experience to provide that extra tutoring. But, we just want to make sure that the support staff are well trained and again, aligned with the curriculum. The student teacher ratio is really important. The most effective programs have really small ratios where it's maybe 2 students for every tutor, and 4 being sort of the point at which it's a little bit, if you go beyond that, you don't have as much of an impact on student achievement and academic progress. During the school day is best, but we've seen from the research that tutoring done well can be effective out of school, after school. But we from our research, we saw overwhelmingly that it's less effective if students are pulled out of class. It should supplement the class schedule. So students are taking, let's say if it's math, tutoring their math class fully, and then getting some additional math instruction instead of replacing. We think it should be as frequent as possible. So, not just for one semester or for, once or twice a month, but as if possible, with the right resources, which we hope to advocate for, at least an hour a day, and hopefully all year, but as frequently as possible. We've seen in terms of the subjects that are most effective, it's both effective for math and reading. But we see for reading in particular, the early grades are where we've seen the best impact in terms of supporting student growth. Math seems to be sort of effective, more effective in the older years than, let's say, additional reading instruction in older years. But again, all of these options are show progress for regardless of the student populations. And then the one area that I really want to emphasize that may not be something that we talk about a ton is the relationship piece, right? I think we kind of conceptually can identify with this notion that a strong relationship for a student with their teacher or their tutor provides better, stronger academic outcomes. But want to mention, particularly in this context where we've seen chronic absenteeism go up, having that adult in a building that has a personal relationship with students and is invested in those students leads to better attendance, leads to better engagement, which when students are engaged in attendance, obviously it is leads to the ability to really reach those students. So a tutor that's committed to using that relationship to drive student success and really emphasizing building those strong and positive relationships, encouraging and developing empathy, patience, encouragement, again, alignment with curriculum, obviously, but really about, making sure that every student has a trusted adult in the building that they know cares for them and is concerned with their well-being. It really has shown success in terms of building motivation, confidence, and all of these sort of foundational factors to lead to better student outcomes.
So switching gears slightly, though, I believe that, relationships and data go hand in hand, but would love to hear you talk a little bit about student data and the importance of use of student data when you think about quality implementation. What should people be thinking about there?
I loved your framing. I mean, you did a really good job, I think, of highlighting, what are the students that, based on the data that's out there, which students would benefit the most? Which are the students that, from an academic standpoint, are struggling the most or have not been provided with the support that's needed? And to be able to, because unfortunately, our resources aren't as widespread in terms of providing support for these programs as possible. The places that we've seen, schools and districts really tap into what does the data say about, not just where our students are at to start and where we need to really devote resources, but once tutoring sort of starts, are we seeing certain groups progress in ways that we need to, really interrogate what's happening to make that happen? And then if we see from a tutoring perspective that certain student populations aren't being provided with the instruction or the support that they need to be successful, where does tutoring actually work the best, and which subjects and which groups? So data is really important. And I think what we've seen from the states where there have been some academic progress, in many states like Alabama, where we've seen some academic progress, North Carolina, even Tennessee, well, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But, there's a real intentionality around like, what are the subject areas where this is working or could work the best? And where do we have the resources to support student growth in those areas? And how do we make sure that we are targeting those resources to those vulnerable populations where the additional instruction and support is actually working? So it's foundational to this.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I'm going to pull in Patrick now. So Patrick, you all are also looking at models across the country. Want to give you a chance to both tell us a little bit about your work, but then also answer the question, when you think about scale, how would you define scale in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Glad to be with everyone today. So at Deans for Impact, we are working every day to ensure that every child in America is taught by a well-prepared teacher. We do this by working with individual leaders of ed prep programs, teams of teacher educators and in-service teachers, and also federal and state policymakers to think about how we can make pathways into teaching more accessible, more affordable, grounded in real practice opportunities working with students, and focused on building the deep instructional expertise that our students deserve in every single teacher. And we do this in the context of preparing a more diverse workforce to better serve and reflect the community of K-12 learners. In the context of tutoring, aspiring teachers, from our perspective, represent the single largest untapped source of labor. There are over 600,000 individuals currently enrolled in teacher preparation programs across this country. These individuals are already invested in the success of students, including their own professional development and growth. And so, Kevin, to answer your question very directly, for Deans for Impact, the scale and sustainability of high impact tutoring in the current political context and reality of learning in America relies heavily on our ability and willingness at both the federal, state, and local level to mobilize and upskill these 600,000 individuals training to be America's next teacher workforce. And so for us teachers, to dive a little bit further into why that is the key to scale for us, is that teachers in training are already receiving specialized training on how to build meaningful relationships with students, like Eric just mentioned, and figuring out how they can actually support student learning. And however, they often lack early opportunities to try out these skills. Many folks in this room are probably teachers themselves and probably remember that the first time they had the chance to work with a student in the context of their own teacher training was probably in the last 12 weeks when they were thrown into a student teaching placement. High impact tutoring holds an opportunity to move that experience way up in a more sheltered environment for both the future teacher as a learner, as well as provide critical instructional supports afforded via high impact tutoring to our P12 learners. So tutoring for us really is just a win-win for getting more highly trained adults working to accelerate P12 student learning and strengthen and diversify pathways of well-prepared teachers into all of our schools. And for these reasons, and with the generous support of Accelerate, which is why Deans for Impact convenes what we call the Aspiring Teachers as Tutors Network. This is a national collaborative of, I think we're over 30 tutoring initiatives now across 17 different states, working day in and day out to mobilize more aspiring teachers as tutors. This collaborative is convened particularly around the idea of how can we identify policy solutions to consistent barriers impacting the ability of successful programs to actually be scaled and sustained. And so to give a little bit of a preview about like our approach at Deans for Impact and in partnership with the 30 plus programs in the Aspiring Teachers Tutors Network to scaling and sustaining high impact tutoring, we believe we've really got to do three things. We need to invest in community partnerships, partnerships that are going to be sustained beyond the physical cliff that I know this community has talked about a lot. Can talk about different structures of what those community investments can actually look like a little later on. The second is how do we shift and leverage policy? I think too often when we talk about scale, we are focused on implementation and not thinking about the systems that are currently in place that either inhibit or create opportunities for scale and sustaining these initiatives. And then finally, I think we all need to do a better job, and DFI and the ATTN are working to do this, is to elevate diverse perspectives and voices in these policy conversations. Too often our policy leaders hear from the same group of us advocating for this idea, but we know it's the practitioners on the ground doing the work every single day in these communities that these elected officials serve, that actually hold the power for moving the needle forward to actually create the systems level changes that will get us to scale over time. So those are a few of the thoughts that we have.
Thanks, Patrick. And thinking about policy, can you talk about some specific examples of actions that state and federal policymakers can take that would help scale tutoring from your seat?
Yeah, so some of the very concrete specific things that leaders can take, both at the federal level and the state level, are drawn from this about a year and a half's work of work by the ATTN to come up with what we call a policy framework for national and state leaders to mobilize more aspiring teachers as tutors. And that work was going out and visiting these local communities and identifying what are the challenges that you're running into. Is this a challenge that is perpetuated by policy, or is it local implementation guidelines that's creating this persistent common challenge across these very differently structured programs? And so we took those learnings and turned them into this policy framework for national and state leaders. And some of the solutions that we identified, or really the three solutions that we identified, were first, to make tutoring a common opportunity for aspiring teachers prior to licensure. The second is, how do we streamline both federal and state funding to enable more aspiring teachers to serve as tutors and ensure program and tutor quality so that students learn and tutors become, one day, strong teachers? Again, these are pretty high-level recommendations, and at Deans for Impact, we have a belief that we can put nice words on paper, but if all they do is sit and collect dust on the website and don't offer tangible steps that our federal and state leaders can take, we ask why are we spending our time in that way? And so we took those recommendations and said, okay, what are the actual pieces of federal and state policy that we can effectuate change on? And I'll offer just a few examples for the community today that the Aspiring Teachers Tutors Network has supported at the federal level. And then, Kevin, if you want, I can dig further into state level practices. So aligned to our first recommendation around making tutoring a common opportunity for aspiring teachers, the ATTN advocated that recently approved national guideline standards for registered apprenticeships. And for those not familiar with teacher training space, this is a very new pathway into teaching that's overseen by the U.S. Department of Labor. And there was an opportunity to create guideline standards to create some safeguards around quality for this pathway. But the ATTN was able to work at the national level with U.S. Department of Labor and other organizational partners to recognize high impact tutoring as an early on-the-job learning experience that is compensated at a specific rate in the context of the federal government. That is creating so many more opportunities for folks to access really practice-based preparation, be paid for specific instructional services, and scale learning supports for K-12 learners, since what is defined in these national guideline standards specifically is high impact tutoring as that specific experience. To streamline funding at the federal level to enable more aspiring teachers, tutors, the ATTN, in partnership with Accelerate and so many others, influenced this broad national movement to incentivize our higher ed partners to increase the percentage of federal work study dollars and federal work study students actually going into community service roles, in particularly going into high impact tutoring roles. And so we were advocating for an increase up to 25% of an institution's allocation, and the guidance put out by the U.S. Department of Education landed at 15%. So we know there's still room to show up and continue to push the needle on that specific pot of funds. And then finally, aligned to our third recommendation around ensuring program and tutor quality, the ATTN champions bipartisan, bicameral legislation that would actually codify a definition of high impact tutoring grounded in the current evidence base that friends at Accelerate and the National Student Support Accelerator and so many others, including EdTrust, have created for us. And so we're really excited about the power of federal definitions to both incentivize who gets funded and what gets funded in order to drive both broad program quality and tutor quality. Happy to talk about state level examples, Kevin, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to pull in Eric, and then Patrick, we're going to get at state from this next question. So Eric, you talked about one path to scale, and in fact, I would argue it's maybe the only path to true national scale is finding the places that have done the best scaled work and figuring out how to help replicate them and learn from them and proliferate them around the country. And Patrick, I would say a similar thing is true for you all, both in your network, you're finding the programs, letting them figure out what are the best practices, and then helping to figure out how you scale those to states across the country. And this, from my previous seat in a state agency, I think is also, the only path to scale inside a state. You find the districts that are doing the best work, and you figure out how do you get them to scale. This is hard in education, though. It's really hard. So Eric, I'll give you the impossible task of talking about what do you think is key in high dosage tutoring when we see places that are doing this really well. How do we ensure that we learn the right lessons and help other people build the kinds of programs that would allow us to achieve greater national scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I've really appreciated your framing on this, particularly around, being very targeted about the interventions and the types of scaling that's done. I think both from what are the successful practices and how do we make sure to highlight them and spread them as best as possible, but also which student populations are benefiting and which student populations need that additional support based on the data from a variety of sources. And then, how do we target that, whether it's a decision to say, we've done a little bit of literacy instruction and a little bit of math instruction, and math is really where we've made the best inroads. So to your point, Kevin, we need to expand that and invest in math strategies and figure out what is working from that to either use for our literacy instruction or to tailor the effectiveness of our literacy instruction to where the research and our data show there's actually success. And one example that, I don't think will be discussed, but I'm really excited to hear about Tennessee and others, is what I think North Carolina did, which is essentially take a look at a variety of data and say, from our, attendance data, from our summer school data, from our academic progress data that's been disaggregated, and it includes sort of grade bands and grade levels. Where do we see the highest impact on students that need the most support? And they decided, while investing broadly in multiple opportunities and subject areas to invest in tutoring, that they were really going to target middle school math because they saw this is where our students have struggled. But we also see that when provided with tutoring support and provided with the right interventions, that there's academic progress. And they've already seen, after deciding to make that investment, a real increase in both their literacy outcomes, but also in their math outcomes for specific student populations that have that they saw were struggling. And so I think that within this whole discussion about scaling and about implementation science, it's really, are we looking at the programs, to your point, Kevin, that have been successful? And are we able to put those leaders into rooms with other leaders in the space to help share those findings? Are we able to sort of take some of the high level, interventions that they invested in and provide that support and infrastructure from a policy perspective to incentivize and encourage and support other districts and schools to do similar work? But again, what are the student populations that are actually struggling and that need that support? And how do we really plug into those student populations who are vulnerable and need that real, intensive targeted tutoring to see some of the academic outcomes that we want to see?
I appreciate that, Eric. And I sort of lit up when you talked about putting those leaders in the room with other leaders, because that's the thing that I have seen work in scaling different initiatives in education in my career is, they don't want to hear from people like us who have the policy perspective and so on. We can provide a bunch of information and so on. But at the end of the day, if you want a district to take on the work, they need to hear from another district leader who has done this work and has credibility with them in meets them where they are. And Patrick, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about in your teacher prep communities, how you think about scaling this. You've got your early actors, but with 600,000 teacher prep candidates across the country, how do you take your early actors and ensure that this scales to the hundreds and hundreds of programs that are out there?
Yeah, such a good question, Kevin. And I'll start where Eric and you just left off, which is like, we have to elevate the work that is taking place. And so DFI has been super committed to how do we show up in these communities that have been doing the work, some of them for decades, and some of them early adopters in this newest wave of mobilizing aspiring teachers, tutors, to actually help them tell their story, both locally to incentivize our philanthropic partners, both at the local level, the state level, and even the regional level, to further fund and find ways to make these types of programs happen, but also like elevating these stories in broader national media landscapes and in policymaking circles so that we can like really bridge the connection between this is what's happening. How can whatever level of leadership you own, what is your role in supporting us make shifts that can get this to scale to other prep providers in my local community, in my region, in my state, or if you're thinking at the federal level, across the entire country. And so I do think we can't just like skip and say, oh, everyone's going to do it. I think we've got to start by building the value proposition. And I think we do that by telling really authentic stories and elevating the perspectives of local leaders actually doing this work. And then I think in the context of higher ed, evidence is really important. And so for our early adopters who have undergone randomized control trials and other types of evidence gathering exercises, it's really important to point to those for our higher ed institutions in particular to say, this is working. Let's show up and continue to figure out ways to make this possible for more future teachers and more P12 learners. So we can't skip over the fact that we have to point to evidence that our P12 learners are not just making gains in their own academic and emotional growth, but the tutors who hold this profile and identity as a future teacher are also demonstrating growth. And how are we measuring that growth? How are we understanding that their experience as a tutor is actually preparing them to be a successful teacher one day? What instructional strategies can they learn in a tutoring context? Let's say literacy, early literacy, even more specifically, that will serve them much better when they're engaging a struggling reader as a classroom leader of their own. And so I really think that like continuing to point to both the evidence of P12 student growth and the growth of the tutors and the skills that tutoring can provide this next generation of American teachers is a really big value proposition builder for our teacher preparation community. I also think how we do this is oftentimes, Kevin, I'm told by the teacher prep community that it's just an onslaught of initiatives coming from the state and federal government that everyone is always trying to apply to and figure out how to create capacity for. I think that we need to like take account and take stock of what all those initiatives are, figure out how to streamline them, and figure out how high impact tutoring intersects across those. For example, lots of states have begun to adopt requirements around the science of reading and expectations for future teachers to be trained on science of reading. How can we talk about how high impact tutoring intersects and creates opportunities for folks to use those skills and live into those standards that we're putting on paper? Another great one is how can we use high impact tutoring to eliminate educator shortages? There's so many grant programs out there around designing new programs like register apprenticeships and grow your own pathways. How are we putting high impact tutoring in a place to be one of the levers in those broader policy conversations? I think would go a long way in bringing more aspiring or more teacher preparation programs into the fold. And then my last piece of advice, Kevin, would be to really, we've got to build a big tent. I don't think it can be, what can teacher prep do? What can K-12 do? What can policymakers do? I think we all need to be sitting under the same tent, really rolling up our sleeves and figuring out what those barriers are and how to remove them so we can get to scale.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the whole opportunity cost point gets lost a lot of times. It's not that people are saying, I don't want to do this thing that works. It's, I have a lot of things that I'm trying to do, and every new thing that I do, there's an opportunity cost. But I would refer all of this back to Eric's intersection between relationships and data. You know, if you've got data that shows that something works that you can present to somebody, and then you've got the right person who is sharing that data because they have a relationship with who they're sharing it with, you've got some chance of spreading practices. So to continue the discussion, I want to bring in 4 leaders now who have direct experience with this work in programs that have scaled. And I'm excited to get at this across cities and states. I'll start at the state level with my personal favorite, I'm biased, but my personal favorite state agency, the Tennessee Department of Education. So Tess, excited to bring you in and would love for you to talk about your statewide work to scale tutoring in Tennessee with the Tennessee All-Core, and how you conceive of what scale looks like in a state with 1 million kids.
Absolutely. And I agree, Tennessee is a great place. Glad to have you as part of someone who has served here. So Tennessee, where we are with Tennessee All-Core, that is our statewide tutoring initiative, is we have launched a program about 2.5 years ago to address this COVID learning loss. Knowing that students were falling behind, we needed a way to rapidly accelerate students to grade level. So about 2.5 years ago, we put in place something that we call Tennessee All-Core, which is our high dosage, low ratio tutoring program. We ended up releasing statewide grants to any district that wanted to participate, had 87 districts participate and hop on board, as well as 5 community partners. And we've been able to reach about 200,000 students across the last 2.5 years. And so I know that's a large number, and I wouldn't say we're quite at scale. So listening to what scale sounds like and looks like, I would say in my mind, it is the option for all districts and all schools to be able to use tutoring as an intervention method, to look at their students, to understand where tutoring can be powerful, and to be able to provide tutoring as an intervention method for pockets of students within their schools and districts. And when they implementing with Fidelity, following a model that's working, following a data-driven model, and following a model that works for their community as well. So in Tennessee, when we scaled, we were in the same boat as I would say many of you about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. We knew what the research said about tutoring, and we knew that we wanted to put in place tutoring. And we knew we have 147 districts across the state of Tennessee. And so there was a 2-pronged approach to this. One part of it, our legislative members really looked at tutoring as a strategy to accelerate students to grade level and put in place some laws that required tutoring for certain groups of students. They gave districts time to do it, time to implement, time for us to understand what this would look like and how this would look. And then at the same time, our state allocated about $140 million of our learning loss money in ESSER to support the tutoring efforts. So we did that through district grants, community partner grants, as well as some support structures. So implementation networks, resources, guides, staffing, et cetera, to be able to support these districts. That was really how we were able to scale, as we opened up a tutoring grant to any district who wanted to participate. And we did a competitive bid process for community partners that allowed for districts who wanted to follow our very strict model to put in place a grant program for tutoring and try this out and work with us on what this looks like, where this could go. And that allowed our community partners to increase capacity of districts or to reach districts that didn't have tutoring anywhere else. So when we rolled this out, our thought was really, what does that loose tight look like? What are those guardrails that we need to put in place? And so we know what the research says about tutoring. We knew we needed a tight ratio. So it's 3-to-1 in our elementary, 4-to-1 in our middle school, We knew our students needed to meet 2 to 3 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes. They needed to meet for a full year, at least a semester of 12 weeks each semester. We knew it needed to be aligned to tier 1. Very strict, aligned to your tier 1. We knew our tutors needed to be trained and supported, and whenever possible, we needed it to be in person. So we put in place these very tight requirements of here's the model you will follow, here's how you progress monitor, here's how you take attendance, here's some of the tools you will use. Then what we let districts do is figure out what worked in their community. So then you get to decide, when do you want to do it? Do you do it during the day? Do you do it out of school? Do you do a combination? Who are you selecting as your students? We'll give you some guidance there, but you select your students, you place them into groups, you group your students, you make it work in your community. And so put those things in place. What we started to see is districts starting to innovate in their communities and in their spaces. We put in place also district implementation networks, as well as a community of practice for our community partners, where we brought folks together and said, all right, this part of Tennessee, all of West Tennessee, come together. Let's talk about what's working in tutoring. We created a space, we created the time, we created the topics for us to talk about, and we allowed districts to come together and share. What we heard is districts standing up saying, hey, I'm a teeny tiny rural district. How do you do X, Y, Z? I'm seeing many of these questions in the Q&A of how do we tap into retired tutors? I had a district share a month or two ago. He goes to a retirement community. He drives over to the retirement community and meets with people and says, hey, are you a former educator? Do you want to come tutor with us? He also has made friends with a local college in which all of the students in a certain class come and tutor in his school. And so he's able to share, here's some of the strategies that are working for our particular district that other districts could use. So what we've seen is districts want to do best practices. They want to implement what's working. They just need support and ideas. But putting that really tight guidelines around this is what we need to do because this is what research is saying is working well in place, and then allowing districts to say, okay, I'm a teeny tiny rural district versus I'm one of the largest districts in Tennessee, it's going to look very different. So allowing them to have that space. The other thing we have learned is it takes a long time. Allowing districts to pilot, allowing community partners to pilot. One of the districts told us, it's going to be a challenge whether you dip your toe in or jump fully in. So allow folks to dip their toe in if that's all they're ready for, allow them to jump fully in if they need to. But we've seen that from especially our community partners. It takes a long time to go from tutoring 0 kids to tutoring 6,000 kids. That's not an overnight thing. We can't stand up programs quickly with Fidelity. And so allowing districts to say, okay, how do I work with districts? Who are these students? How do we get those 100 kids in the door for our first semester? And then second semester, we'll take those lessons learned, we'll take those materials we've created, we'll take that tutor training, and we'll scale that up so that everyone can do it. So I'd say in Tennessee, we've been able to rapidly scale over 2.5 years, but I would say it has been mostly putting in place guardrails, allowing districts space to come together and talk about what's working and sharing those best practices. We do a lot of virtual convenings. It's open to all districts at this point, allowing them to share what's working and what's not working. And then just giving them time of taking time to understand what's working in your district, to build out materials in order to really make sure that this is working for your individual students.
That's so helpful, and gave a lot of rich, specific ideas to people. And the loose type framework for states, I think, is helpful. And the definition of scale is creating something where it's an option for all districts and schools to use it, and then doing the work that sort of facilitates that. I also think the slow build is what we've seen as a best practice in states and districts, that you can't do it overnight, but you can, if you do it for 3 years in a row, get to a point where suddenly you look up and tens of thousands of kids are getting an intervention that really helps. So appreciate all of this. I want to turn to a couple of our program leaders, and I'll start with you, Ola. We know Reading Partners has now scaled across 9 states and DC and is continuing to grow. And I wondered if you might talk about how your online platform changed your ability to scale and what that looks like as you think about scaling in the future as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And also thank you, Emily. Yeah, so it's hard. I know it's been like 4 years since the beginning of the pandemic, but it's so hard to not answer this question by first going back to 2020 for us. The pandemic was no less challenging for reading partners than I think it was for other organizations and districts and folks who are represented here. And I think for us, a big silver lining is that it significantly accelerated our progress that we were able to make in terms of developing an online tutoring platform. So just for context, for folks who don't know that much about Reading Partners, we've been around for about 25 years. We were started in Menlo Park and California, and we have since expanded in the way that Kevin just shared. And for about 22 years, all of the work that we had done was paper-based, and it was in schools, directly working, with students through our AmeriCorps program and also with our staff. And while that model still exists, a way for us to truly think differently about scale, not just growth. When I think of scale, I think exponential growth. And for us, so much of that was because of the pandemic and our ability to create an online tutoring platform called Reading Partners Connects. And it's just opened up a ton of possibilities for us in terms of who we can reach and how we can reach them. So in the past, if you take like a massive, massive city like New York City, where there are many different boroughs, and I think that's like the size of many cities and other in other parts of the country, we had to match, let's say, a corporate volunteer in a school that was close to where they were working. So they could leave during the day, they could go, they could come back. Now, what we're able to do throughout all of our partnerships in New York City and also that in many of our other cities across the country is allow for virtual tutoring so that it is still the curriculum, it is still a human who is doing the tutoring, but it is a virtual model. And so that's allowed us to really think differently about how we tutor. And over the past few years, we've also started to develop a training and licensing, a licensing and training partnership so that all of the work that we're doing and the way that we're thinking about scale is that Reading Partners doesn't have to be at the center of that scale. We do not have to be the people delivering the tutoring, but we can actually partner not only with schools, but also with other nonprofit organizations, with libraries, and many other great community-based organizations to provide training and technical assistance to them so that they can use our curriculum and do the tutoring themselves. So that's just kind of how we think about scale. And I think that's how we've been able to leverage our online platform to really grow.
That's super helpful. And, it's funny, I know that you're in San Diego right now, right? At the GSV conference, which is focused on ed tech. And I was just there and was struck the whole time I was there by this question of how do you leverage these new technologies in a universe where it's clear that human relationships are still so important. And
Yes.
how do you think about that? And is your thinking changing as you see new tools, or do you think that functionally we still just have to figure out how to engage human relationships as part of this equation?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I'm going to take what I heard from a colleague of mine, the CEO of Ignite. Her name is Jess. We were just on a panel. I'm still, as you said, I'm in San Diego, and I was just on a panel right before coming into this conversation. And she talked about the idea of HI or human intelligence and AI, and that also meeting data. And I think she's right. Like you need all of that. You need to look at data, both quantitative and qualitative, to understand what is working. You want, I think AI or innovation and other technology can help support the work that you're doing. But I think there's nothing that changes a human to human connection and that interaction. I think relationships matter. I think the challenges that we have seen over the last starting 4 years ago, where children and educators weren't able to be as connected in person because of some of the challenges related to the pandemic, I think those are real. And I think that it's important. I think, what has helped us do what we've done, which is deliver over 2 million tutoring sessions to children across this country, mobilize and recruit over 80,000 volunteers to support over 77,000 students. I think all of that has been possible because of the humans. I think, so that is important. I think the way that we think a bit to just make it a bit more granular. So, we believe in the science of reading. That's our curriculum. Everything that we do in our curriculum is embedded. The science of reading is embedded into all that we're doing and how we teach kids how to read. And we know that AI can only advance some of that work. So for example, our tutors aren't going anywhere, but imagine if we were to partner with another an AI literacy organization specifically on helping a student with decoding. Would we entertain that, or is that something that we would pilot? Probably yes. And it doesn't take away the tutor, it doesn't take away that work. Someone else described it as like thinking about an electrical bike or like a human engagement. You need a person to be on the bike for it to work and to burn calories. And then thinking about that in something like a Roomba, that, automatic vacuum cleaner that just goes, that can fall down the steps if a human isn't engaging. I think that's how we're kind of balancing and thinking about that. And I think also it's hard to think about AI and technology and advancements and innovation without also thinking about who's left behind and who's brought it to the table, and how are we embracing equity and race, diversity, and inclusion when we think about all things AI and how to advance what happens for young people. So I think it's not a lot of answers for you there, Kevin, but I think those are just some questions and things that we think about. But yeah, I mean, I think the role that humans can play, adults, the teachers, educators, families, volunteer tutors, paid tutors, are so critical. And I think that AI can only help to accelerate by maybe using small components of that, but not to replace that fully, not to replace the human.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I'm going to turn to Mary Ellen and Saga, which has, of all tutoring programs, had among the most successful runs in scaling across states and districts. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you all have seen about districts in different places and their willingness to embrace your model, and what has it taken to get so many different districts to raise their hands and say they are interested in implementing tutoring with Saga?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I think similar to what Ola and Tess were saying, and specifically at Saga, we originally started as a direct service turnkey model where we were bringing all of the tutors and all of the staff to districts in order to run high impact math tutoring for them. And then as things have changed over the past few years, we're now partnering with districts across the US for them to launch their own high impact tutoring. And that gives them the opportunity to say, partnering with us, here are the metrics for success that we have seen in terms of the ratio, who you need in place in order to support the tutors, training for your tutors, liaisons at your districts. But then what customizations do you want to make that work for you given your districts and your school context? So I know Tess was talking about this, and even thinking about going into districts and having them pilot first, whether it's for a semester or for an entire year, getting some people who can be the champions within your district to then say, we tried it this way, this is the feedback I'm giving you, and this is how it would work differently if we were to do it again, really helps then to get bigger and larger buy-in within your district and hear from their peers about what worked and what didn't work, so that others are more invested in bringing tutoring into their schools.
I love that. I love the idea of piloting and getting people to start doing the work, figure out what's working and what's not, make adjustments, and use that as a pathway to scale. I'm going to ask you about tech as well. Saga has done a lot of work with technology and trying to figure out what does it mean to build a hybrid model? What does it mean to build virtual delivery? How have you seen programs incorporate technology into tutoring in a way that helps increase the number of students who have access to it?
Yeah, technology can be a great way to increase the student to tutor ratio that you have by allowing the students to work independently on an adaptive practice tool and then having other students work directly with their tutor. So if you're thinking about a caseload, traditionally we see one tutor with 3 students. If you up that to 6 students working with the tutor, you still have the 3 who are working directly with that tutor that they have, while 3 other students are working on an adaptive tool that normally the content is delivered through standards that the teacher has aligned, is changing and adapting to how the student's answering the questions and allows them to work independently, where then they switch every other day, halfway through the class period, however you have it structured, so that they still get that attention and human connection with their tutor while they get the independent time. So I think that's really important if you're thinking about your costs that you have, increasing your student to tutor ratio, and then thinking about that true independent work that students do and what type of adaptive response can they get that the technology is giving them.
And how have you seen, as you all collect a lot of evidence and a lot of data and do a lot of analysis, have you seen the evidence hold up as you all have moved more into using technology to increase the number of students?
Yeah, from the different randomized control trials that we were in, we saw that the evidence from students working with their tutor every day to then bringing in the blended model ended up being exactly the same. And that's because the material is still content and grade level aligned, and they're still getting that important human connection with their tutor, where they're able to address those misconceptions, build that relationship that so many people have touched on, and where that tutor can then respond in the moment. And that other portion, they're still getting some type of individualized attention. So we have seen that when you're incorporating it at a 50-50 ratio of 50% with the tutor, 50% on adaptive practice, they are getting the same results that we saw from our very first randomized control trial.
That's great. Very helpful. Dave, I want to pull you in. And so you've been working in Philadelphia to increase the number of kids who have access to joyful readers, and talk a little bit about what high dosage tutoring looks like for joyful readers in your context, and what you think makes it work. And then we can get into a little bit what it is look like to try to scale across different schools and organizations across a big city.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking a little bit about tech and about virtual tutoring. Everything we're doing is in person in Philadelphia. And so we have AmeriCorps members that we recruit and that we train to serve full-time in schools throughout the city. We're in 15 schools in our second year, serving about 850 students right now. And the way our tutoring works is it's all in pairs, 2 students at a time, and they see their tutor 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day. So we're going for a fairly intensive dosage with them. And then each of those tutors in turn, they'll have typically 10 or 11 groups of students. So they're working all day with kids. And I think for us, what's enabling some of the success for us is first is those relationships that you're referencing, and that I haven't been to a tutoring session yet where I haven't seen a kid be super excited to get started with a tutor, to be out with kids. You see in the hallways, if tutors are going to pick up another couple students from class, there's kids in every line in grades K-3 who are stopping and hugging the tutor and, kind of want to be with them. And that happens from that exposure, that proximity, that they're with them every day. And that same thing relates over to our teachers, who have the opportunity to get to know our tutors, to partner with them deeply, so that if there's an assembly one day, the tutors and the teachers can just figure out and say, hey, I know you couldn't take Kevin and Ola at 9:30 this morning, but we can rearrange things. If you move your prep into the morning, you'll get those kids in the afternoon. We'll make it work. And that's hard to do without that relationship. I think the other piece that's really working for them is training and support. And all of our tutors are taking a graduate course in reading instruction from the AIM Institute. And that's really, it's helping them gain a deep understanding of the work that they're doing, maybe even deeper than they need day to day for their work, but it allows them to truly get what they're doing in the science of reading. And then it gives them credibility with partners in schools. We've got teachers who are saying, I'm clamoring to get into that class. I want my school to pay for that course. And so when they see the tutors taking it, they say, okay, this is a partner. This isn't someone who's going to come in and I don't know what they're going to do with our kids, but they see them as a partner. And I think that, combined with weekly coaching for us, is what's helping accelerate things in Philadelphia.
That's super helpful. By the way, I want to just make sure people watching know that in about 5 minutes, we're going to get into Q&A. So if you've got a question that you've been dying to ask, now's a good time to put it in the Q&A box, as Emily is helping to think about where we go after this. So Dave, talk a little bit about working across, you're in 15 schools, I think, in Philadelphia, plus
Yep.
4 CMOs. And obviously, every place is a little bit different. What have you learned as you've scaled across these different buildings and across different CMOs as well?
I think that as far as learning goes, we've had to be really serious about what are the non-negotiables for us. And then at the same time, what is the learning that we have to do of where we actually have to be flexible and where our model should make minor adjustments, maybe from one charter management network to another, maybe from the school district to a charter school, whatever it is, or maybe just between schools. I'll give you a couple examples. So our very first year, pressure's on to make things work. One of our partners kind of said, hey, by the way, every adult in the building takes a coverage in the hallway. So we need your tutors to, do bathroom coverage or dismissal, whatever it looks like, right? And as a brand new program without a lot of traction, it's a little scary to say no sometimes and say that doesn't work for us. We can't have one fewer tutoring session because that's how the adults in the building operate. We knew that, the way that we had sold this to the people coming into our program was that you're going to have your work focused on working directly with kids as tutors. And so we had to really figure out exactly where would we stand firm on the work. At the same time, we thought, okay, we're going to have 11 pairs of kids every day. That's going to be the schedule. What we didn't take into account was what about the school where you have to walk from the little school building on the same lot to the big school building to get the kids that are in 3rd grade to take them back to your space. But then the 1st graders are nearby and they're really close to you, right? And so that might mean maybe in that school you actually can't do 11 sessions. It's not going to work because there's just a lot of walking going on, right? And so it's just 2 examples, but I think the biggest thing is really defining what is a part of you and your identity, that no matter where you are in a city, throughout the country, that can't change. And then we've had to figure out, okay, where can we question some of our assumptions and where are we still going to be effective if we do things a little bit differently, school to school.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, we started this segment with Tess talking about the state, but it's a completely analogous situation. It's the whole tight loose question. It's like, what are the things that we are going to set up as standards that apply to everybody, but how are we going to ensure that we are allowing local context to play a role in design that does not ameliorate effects, but instead just makes people have more buy-in, which is really interesting. So appreciate for all of you. Let me just ask one question for maybe everybody in the group. If you could just give us one sentence, I'll take it through Tess, Marielle, and Dave. What are you most optimistic about for next year when you think about 24-25 school year? And I'll start with Tess.
What I'm most optimistic about, tutoring's working. We are seeing districts that get amazing results. We are seeing districts who are really able to move the needle on kids and able to say, here's our kids in that approaching category where we've been focusing. And we go from, what do we have? 44% of this group of kids have now moved to proficiency. So we are seeing it work in our community partners. We're seeing it work in our districts. We're seeing our districts find models that work in their communities and being able to really move kids. And so that's really exciting to watch the last 2.5 years of figuring out what's working, who are the right students, what's the right model for us, how do we work in our community, and be able to see that growth and that data and be able to narrow in on here's how students can benefit from tutoring, and to be able to continue to expand that throughout our state, have them share their best practices, have them share their learning, but really excited for our districts to be able to continue that great work, because it's one thing to sit here and talk about the number of students being impacted, but also to be able to look and see this is students on an individual level, moving from below grade level to being able to read or do math on grade level is just really life-changing. So really excited to be able to see that happen across our state.
Super inspiring. Ola, what are you most optimistic and excited about as you think about next school year?
Yeah, I'll just say 2 things. Tess, that was really inspiring. That wasn't one of my 2 things, but that was really inspiring. I'm excited by how many people are on this call, how many people are here answering questions about literacy, just how many people across the country are doing this work. So outside of Reading Partners, I'm just excited. It takes a village. We're all part of this ecosystem. Every single one of us are needed. And I'm excited for there to be more and more. So I'm very excited about that. And then within our organization, I'm excited about the momentum that we have with AmeriCorps. We've been in AmeriCorps program similar to you, Dave, for I think over 20 years now. And I'm very, very excited about the fact that the number of AmeriCorps members are growing. That is a great sign for what's to come of just young people and folks who are looking for service. And then also that our growth isn't dependent upon simply how we're growing our staff. So in places like Detroit, we're able to grow our impact and we don't have staff on the ground there. We're partnered with other organizations. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Thanks. That's great. Mary Ellen, what about you? When you think about next school year, what are you most optimistic and excited about as you think about Saga's work?
Yeah, I think Tess kind of hinted at this as well. We're kind of coming out of districts trying it and seeing what worked well, and now actually seeing where can I grow and how many more schools can I expand to for next year, because they figured out what's working for them. I think is one of the first things that I'm really excited to see. And then the second is that through the research with the University of Chicago for their personalized learning initiative, they're coming out with preliminary data that shows that districts can do this and they can scale and can do it well if they're thinking about how they're implementing it. So continue to see that research grow, that will hopefully bring more people on board to seeing how high impact tutoring can work for them.
Great. All right, David, you get to close us out before we go to Q&A and kick it back to Emily. What are you excited and optimistic about?
Yeah, I'm going to say this in the context of Philadelphia, where we are, which is that the city is making great strides on Tier 1 instruction, right? And so that is going to be part of the strategy that supports all learners throughout our city. And then we're getting better at our work. Our first evaluation was really positive, where we saw that students on average moved from the 22nd percentile to the 30th, and that students in every school that we partnered with beat their growth goals. And so that's a great start. But in year one, we were still figuring a lot out. And now we're able to systematize some of the things that we're learning, and they're not just part of our muscle memory, but they're part of our identity, and that we're building them into our work. And so we want to improve our results as tutors, but then we want that to piggyback off of the great work that's happening in our charter schools and in our district in Philadelphia.
Thanks so much. Emily, I'm going to let you, you've had a chance to look through some of the questions that have come in as we've gone, and I'll let you pull some out for our esteemed panelists.
Yeah, and I'm going to say thank you to our awesome panelists for answering questions, and thank you to our audience. These are very specific questions, so I can tell everybody on this call, on this webinar today, is working very, very hard to scale tutoring, to implement tutoring. Your questions are very specific, and we really appreciate that. David, thank you so much for posting your contact info. A lot of you had specific questions for David, but there was several questions that were about recruiting and supporting students, training students. So Thomas and Tracy McCabe, you had questions about the virtual, like does that help you get more tutors or highly qualified tutors, leveraging retired teachers? I feel like we covered those questions already. Eddie Tafoya, I get the sense that he's about to launch a huge tutoring program because he's asking, and this is a great question, like, do you have some resource, or is there like some best pipeline? Like if you want to start a program and have, like, you know, whatever it is, 60 tutors at the ready, like what is your recommendation for the best sources, best pipeline for getting a whole bunch of tutors all at once? So yeah, Eddie had a couple questions related to that.
That's a great question. I think some of our folks who are leading programs who are thinking about this day in, day out might have some thoughts on this. So does anybody want to jump in and say, you're launching a program, where are the first places that you would go?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and share. I think launching a program and trying to recruit volunteers in and of itself is hard, especially when the community where you're trying to recruit may not know that much about what you're doing, or if what you're, you know, if your efforts or your program is new. I think it's really important that the people doing the recruiting should be from the community and know the community. I think far too often when we try and do work in communities, we don't do them with the community. We do it to or for, and just, you know, how are you? Someone said earlier, something about going to centers where folks who are retired are and working directly with them. I think just depending on the community, understand where volunteers are, talk to other local volunteer-based organizations, find out where they're getting their tutors. A lot of high schools, depending on the age and stage of, your tutor pool, a lot of high schools across the country and districts give high school students volunteer hours. So is that a way? And then there's a lot of new legislation around work study for college students. Are there institutions of higher ed where maybe the university or college will pay the students, so you're not paying them, but where they can volunteer? Are you going to volunteer fairs? Are you talking to families of the students that you're trying to tutor? So those are some of the routes that we take. But I think what we find, our biggest challenge is when the person doing the recruitment is not from that community. There's like a way that we need to build relational trust. And I think it's oftentimes hard if you're not from that community.
That's super helpful. And I want to build on what Ola was just saying in terms of this sort of wide net. I think one thing that we've seen in research is the more prescriptive the curriculum, the broader the range of people who can deliver it. And so I think if you want to cast a wide volunteer net for delivery of tutoring, I would put a lot of time and energy into ensuring that you've got the right curriculum and the right training, because the more narrow and prescriptive the curriculum, the more likely it is that a volunteer workforce can be trained to deliver it effectively. And there's evidence that supports that.
And just building on, Ola, what you referenced, there was a couple questions about full-time students. So our good colleague Jess Tilley asked, aspiring teachers are often full-time students. So are there models that work for them? And our anonymous attendee who's asked tons of questions. I don't know if it's all one anonymous attendee or multiple, but asked this really important question, like sometimes the work study amount that a student has doesn't match the need of the tutoring program. So anybody who wants to comment on sort of like the full-time tutor work study perspective.
I'll just say in New York City, that's one of our largest regions at Reading Partners. I believe it's close to 20 or 25% of our tutors are, in fact, enrolled in college. And so they're able, we try to be as flexible as we can with hours, and we ask our schools to be as flexible as they can as well. And so I think that certainly helps, but we tend to have like a specific time, a specific date and time each week that stays consistent, that our tutors, that we ask our tutors to be available, and that has helped. And I think we just ask for feedback from the very college students who are tutoring, and we ask them to recruit other people. I think similar to something that you were saying earlier, Kevin, about the practitioners or who are the people that leaders want to hear from. I think if we're trying to recruit college students, they want to hear from other college students, not just our recruiters. And so we try to also think about that.
Patrick, do you want to jump in on thinking about full-time students who are in teacher prep programs and how they can afford to do this, and also any thoughts based on your engagement with work study?
Yeah, for sure. I was going to build on what Ola said, is that it starts with investing in community partnerships, and federal work study is one tool. I also think we need to recognize that our full-time aspiring teachers who are full-time students are also working 2-3 other jobs in order to be able to subsidize their preparation to become a future teacher. Most of these folks have to work in unpaid student teaching positions. That is a reality that is out of grasp for a lot of people in this country. And so our push is to not think about tutoring as an add-on experience in the context of teacher preparation, but how can we thoughtfully incorporate high impact tutoring into the design of teacher preparation so that there are other incentives besides just pay that becomes available through federal work study. It becomes a licensing requirement. It becomes an expectation and is built into their program so that the work that they're doing in this instructional setting is compensated, even if not to the fullest extent that we would want to see them compensated for full-time work. It's how do we build in and tap into existing innate desires to work with students and keep them in those instructional settings like high impact tutoring instead of going down the street to the local Starbucks in order to try to make ends meet. I think we have to be careful not to just add on to the experiences and expectations, because people rightfully are going to choose the lowest barrier to like making those basic need or meeting their basic needs. And so we need to start removing those barriers. And Federal Work Study is one tool that can do that. And we recently went out and visited Step Up Tutoring out in California, who I think now has something like 16 Federal Work Study partnerships with 16 different higher ed institutions across the country. And a huge portion of those are partnerships directly with the schools of education at these institutions. And Sam Oliveri, the CEO there, has lots of advice on like what it takes to persist and keep showing up and tap into those local institutions and those individual college students as the ambassadors for the programs. And I love that. And so I'll pop in a resource for folks to learn more about how one community out in California is really taking Federal Work Study to scale.
That's awesome. Thank you. So now I have a pair of questions. This was also from our anonymous attendee, but interestingly, and we just posted our feedback poll, and I can't express how seriously we take your feedback. So please take a few minutes while you're still listening to just quickly answer these questions. And we directly use your feedback. But so these questions, I'm going to put them together. So, you know, we talked a lot about tutoring as an on-ramp for teaching and how important that is right now with, you know, sort of like, you know, the teacher profession seeing a drop. But what about developing tutoring? Because tutors are always going to be needed as a field in itself. And paired with that is how can we make sure that tutors are really recognized as part of a student's academic learning journey as much as or in similar ways as teachers are, you know, for the families, for the teachers, for the, you know, the administrators, for everybody. So it's both like, you know, what do you think about tutoring as a field in and of itself, you know, both like in addition to an on-ramp for teaching or maybe even instead of, and then what's your sort of advice for making sure that tutors get the sort of acknowledgement and recognition that they need in the students' learning journey?
Great questions. Eric, I wonder if I could get your thought on just tutoring as an ongoing field or profession in and of itself, and any thoughts that you have from the sort of national policy arena as you look at across the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really encouraging to see that the narrative has sort of shifted to this and the importance of tutoring and how, you know, it should be scaled to support all of the different student needs. And I think, I mean, as evidence from this panel and from the folks who have been working on this issue for so many years, I think students and families have really benefited from tutoring for a really, really long time, and have used that in many ways to drive engagement and to drive, you know, some of the sort of like quote unquote non-academic indicators for ways students feel attached to school and feel like they're valued. So I think this is a great part of the conversation. And I think making sure that we continue these conversations where, you know, I think it feels pretty clear based on not just the way that this conversation was framed, but just the direction of this, that it's pretty established, I think, in our field that tutoring and high dosage tutoring in particular is something that is evidence-based, and we see the academic and non-academic indicators are progress towards it. So, you know, I think there's so many people from different perspectives, whether it's, you know, the AmeriCorps folks who have been a part of this, and the community at large sort of galvanizing around this issue to provide as many tutors as possible, the importance and elevating the importance of not just, you know, the relationships, which we think are really crucial, but the way that this impacts literacy and the way it sort of intersects with the science of reading and math and some of the early numeracy and the continued discussions we've been having. I just think as we continue to bring up these issues that I think our country is continually talking about in terms of how Test scores are showing that math and literacy numbers aren't as high as we like, and that students don't feel as engaged. I think tutoring has to continue to be a really crucial and important part of the solutions towards these big challenges.
All right, so another sort of pair of questions. Jenny Song asking, do you have recommendations for existing sort of quote unquote off the shelf materials or curriculum to train tutors, or organizations that do just that, train tutors? And then at the same time, if you're someone who's at a library, for public library, for example, and you've got a successful tutoring program, but you don't have access to the school's data, do you have recommendations for assessment tools? So both training and assessment tools.
Those are great questions. Anyone out there attuned to training materials that you would recommend, or that you have seen other programs use that you think are effective? And then Tess, I wonder how TDOE, if you all have centralized materials around training tutors, and if you have any thoughts on that in particular.
Well, happy to weigh in. So in Tennessee, we have 2 courses that we created from a statewide perspective. We have one that we call for alternative and aspiring educators, really your non-certified tutors. And that's a 5-module course, walks tutors through the basics of how do you engage with students? What is tutoring? What does this look like? Some of those more basic teaching components of tutoring, as well as what is tutoring. And so we have that available online for free. And then we have a 1-hour, 1-module course for your certified tutors. And that is really what is tutoring and why are we doing tutoring? So really drills down into why are we doing tutoring? How does this differ from teaching? So we make those publicly available to our tutors. I would say what we've seen in Tennessee is you have some excellent teachers who are certified educators who are also serving as tutors. They don't need much training in terms of tutoring. We give them the same tier 1 materials. They are aligned to classroom instruction. They have time in their day to talk to other teachers. They can bridge that gap by themselves. On the other side, you have something from paraprofessionals to volunteers, and they need quite a bit of support. And so it's really that balance within a district or school of where on that continuum of support does a tutor fall and how much support can you give them. We have a few resources. We have a foundational skills supplement that tutors could use. We have it created for tutors so that it's a scripted lesson. And then beyond that, we just work with districts to say the more volunteers or paraprofessional or non-certified staff you have, the more support you need to give them. Whereas the more certified staff you have, the less support. Where do you fall on that continuum, and how do you make sure that you're giving the appropriate support there? But we don't have a ton of out-of-the-box materials just because it looks so different across each of our districts, and each of our districts have adopted different materials.
I'd also shout out our friends at the National Student Support Accelerator, who have on their website some great off-the-shelf tools and links to things for people standing up programs. And so I would go to NSSA and check out what they have. They've got some really great stuff.
Wow. Well, we're at 1 minute. And so I feel like, I love what you did. You asked everybody. Well, I'm going to give everyone the chance to do like a 5-second parting words, because this has been absolutely incredible. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us, rushing back from San Diego, from the big conference. Ola, thank you for joining us from San Diego. And everybody else, this was so impactful. I could tell by the questions people were asking. We really appreciate you sharing your best practices and your knowledge. And I just want, actually, now we're running out of time, so I won't put you all on the spot again, but we say thank you over and over again. And we encourage all of you to join us in the future. We will have more sessions on tutoring. It's not going anywhere, but coming up next week, we're going to focus on ed tech. And we're sort of pairing that one with this one, because we are going to talk a little bit about using technology again to scale tutoring next week. And then coming up, we have a session focused on California's $2 billion settlement. And then, of course, our ongoing series on kindergarten as a sturdy bridge coming up in early May. So thank you for this excellent conversation. Thank you to everybody who's here with us for your great questions, and have a good evening and a good rest of the week, everybody.